We're going to have a conversation with Michael Italiano, and Michael is a Formula One performance coach. And those of you who are watching the Netflix documentary, Drive to Survive, will give you some insight into the world of Formula One. But let's hear it from the man himself. Thanks very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Patrick. It's actually it's a pleasure to talk to you, mate. I'm a big fan of your content, and I must admit I haven't finished the Oxygen Advantage just yet, but I'm getting a ton of info and I'm definitely applying it to my own training. So yeah, it's good to chat.
Great stuff. And I think breathing is just one of those things. And I'm wondering, is it a tool that you use in terms of performance? Or when I'm looking at a young driver, and they're all young, like I looked at Daniel Ricardo, like for example, he's 33 years of age. There's so many different facets to make what constitutes a Formula One driver. What do you think they are in terms of the overall spectrum? If you're working with a driver, what are the tools that you're going to tune in on?
Yeah, I think as a performance coach, the first thing I look at, I start with the physiological, effects that these guys go through, and the physiological demands. So when they're racing, they go through, there's heat exposure, so through the environment, so weather, also the asphalt and the rubber tires create like this massive heat bubble within their cockpit, and they're wearing fire resistant suits, which are not they're not breathable, right? They're not designed for ventilation. They're designed to keep them safe. So that's a big physiological factor there, where it's like is just the heat exposure. Essentially, the cockpit can get up to like 50 degrees. G-force is another one. G-force gets thrown around quite a lot, especially with like Formula One drivers and also like pilots. I think probably the two that you can relate to when it comes to G-force. And also the vibrations of the car. So the vibrations of the car, the drivers are fighting the car in some sense. So there are forces, whether it's longitudinal and lateral forces, that these guys have to endure over a 90-minute race. So usually I start with the physiological demands, and I would program accordingly their training based on, I guess essentially their sport specific demands. So that's kind of where I start from a performance aspect. And then, yeah, as we know, performance, there's so many pillars to performance. There's training, there's nutrition, there's recovery, there's sleep, and then there's cognitive demands, right? So the cognitive demands of these guys is huge. Where do I start? They're driving a car over 300 kilometers an hour for 90 minutes. There's over 20 buttons on their steering wheel. So, they're changing modes. Sometimes they're changing modes nearly every second or third corner, because, they're changing brake balance or something that's just will suit like a long corner or a high speed corner compared to a low speed corner. And then, so that, they've got 20 toggles and 20 functions on their steering wheel, and they're trying to look in their mirrors, either defending or attacking. And then they obviously need to make sure that they keep their perception and intact as well, to make sure that they're hitting the apex and hitting their driver line correctly. There's a whole bunch of cognitive tasks that they're literally going through every lap. I think some races they change gears like 70 times per lap, right? And there's like 50 laps. So, cognitively, like they're changing gears flat out, braking, accelerating, attacking, defending, toggling on the steering wheel. It's insane. Like these guys, they're now getting the recognition that they deserve. Like the sport is just booming, and I think people are starting to understand now how crazy these guys are, from not just a physiological demand, but cognitively how talented these guys are as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember the days when I was a student and at Irvine, and Jordan team and we used to be staying up until about 3 o'clock in the morning watching it. Now I'm looking at it with slightly different eyes. This is about 23, 24 years later. The heat must be something else, because I'm only thinking in terms of what that's going to do to stress levels. It's obviously driving up the heartbeat. And if the heart rate is getting too high, it's going to affect cognitive performance. So tell us a little bit about that. So I'm assuming that the heart rate is monitored, and if a driver, because I remember just watching one of the drivers recently enough, he was losing the head always in behind the wheel, and then he was crashing. So a little bit about that, Michael, because I find that's intriguing. This is the stuff that we can all relate to because, we've been there sooner, sometime or other.
Yes. So the problem with the heat is it will increase their core body temperature quicker than what you'd like, right? So the body can typically endure like a 4 degree difference in core body temperature before some serious side effects start to occur. So in the cockpit, their core body temperature rises quite quickly, literally in the first 10 laps, like their core body temperature is already elevating, right? So what happens then? The body starts obviously trying to cool itself. So you start, so excessive sweating starts to occur. So this is where like your hydration protocol is super important. And this is what else is super important is your cardiovascular fitness, right? Because what we're trying to do, we're trying to delay as much as we can the onset of fatigue, because we know, right, scientifically, the quicker you fatigue, the quicker your cognitive performance starts to decline, right? Your reactions go, right? Your perception starts to go, and your eyesight can actually start to get quite foggy as well, right? And so you can start to lose your perception of vision. So it's very important these guys stay fit, because we want to make sure that we delay that onset of fatigue, right? So we want to make sure these guys can endure as much heat demand as this sport is bringing, right? So that's probably why you probably see us, on the bike doing quite a lot of cardio work. To answer one of the things you mentioned, you said, I assume their heart rate is monitored. So their heart rate is monitored, but monitored by F1. F1 don't give us coaches the data, right? Which is crazy, because we could do so much with that, right? It's an ongoing battle that I'm trying to have. So essentially, it's illegal for us to put any wearable device on the drivers when they drive. So I can't put a heart rate monitor on him. It's forbidden. So usually, what I do when my drivers have testing outside of Formula One, when they pre-season, I will whack a heart rate monitor on, and I'll gather some data. And my data has found that most of the time when they're driving, their heart rate sits within a zone 2, sometimes elevates to a zone 3 in hotter races, and if they're like under high pressured situations. So whether they're defending or attacking.
For somebody who's not familiar with zone 2, zone 3, okay, the heart rate, where are you typically talking about?
Well, it depends on okay, so typically zone 1 is like your resting state. Zone 5 is going absolutely balls out. So everyone's max heart rate and zones will always be a little bit different. It's a very specific zone. So you can just imagine it's on the lower spectrum. So, from 1 to 5, it's between a 2 and 3, right? So if I'm talking my driver, it's between 125 beats per minute till about 145 beats per minute, right? So we do a lot of cardio within that specific zone of training. And I'll also make my drivers perform cognitive drills within that zone when they're doing their cardio stuff. Their cardio exercise. So that is another, I guess, part of it, where it's like, okay, it's very important to be fit, and it's very important to be able to enjoy this heat demand. So probably the last thing that I probably do is I do some heat acclimation training for these guys. So if people don't know what that is, it's essentially just training in hot environments. Yeah, hot environments to get familiar and adaptive to the heat exposure that we're about to go into. So literally right now, so we're on race week in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is actually probably the hottest race of the year. So I've already had Yuki in the sauna for the last 14 days. So usually heat acclimation, you do within, ideally, if you can have like a 15-day window, that has shown to be very, very beneficial. Unfortunately, in Formula One, we don't get 15-day breaks. So research has shown that even up to a 10-day period of heat acclimation training has shown to have some benefit. So we have been doing the last 10 days since Bahrain, literally as soon as Bahrain finished. The good thing is we were in the heat in Bahrain, so you could use that as a bit of a acclimatizing training in itself. I've kept him in a sauna, and what studies have shown is putting yourself in a sauna post exercise, so doing exercise and going straight to a sauna, that has shown to really help from a heat acclimation perspective. So that's something that I do, not with every race. So the hot races, so Saudi being one, Miami gets really hot and humid. Budapest gets super hot in August. Singapore, and sometimes Abu Dhabi, but Abu Dhabi's at night, so we do get lucky sometimes where it does cool off quite a bit. So yeah, so that's essentially it. And then I guess what you can add on top of that is obviously like breathing and just staying calm. And the one thing that I kind of took away from your book is, you know, you're a massive advocate on nasal breathing, which so we should, right? It's what your nose is built for, is to breathe. But you know, there are a lot of us that are mouth breathers. But the good thing about Formula One drivers is they wear a balaclava, and the balaclava covers their mouth, so they're actually forced to nasal breathe in the car. So it's a good little tool for me, because I notice that, you know, my driver, I can only speak for my drivers. My drivers are all nasal breathers in the car because the balaclava covers their mouth, and they have got a little microphone and they'll speak when they need to speak. But I notice when we're doing our cardio sessions, they'll breathe through their mouth. So I've said, hang on a second, guys, you're doing this under such a cognitive and physiological demand with your mouth closed. Why are you training opposite? And Yuki's like, oh, I never thought of that. So then now we've started training our cardio with just nasal breathing. And to be fair, he's actually picked it up quite quickly. I think because he's been driving for so many years, nasal breathing, but he wasn't even aware of it. He wasn't even consciously aware. Like when I first met him, I said, okay, when you're in the car, do you breathe out of your mouth or nose? And he looked at me, he's like, I don't know. I said, well, okay, well, that's the first thing I need you to figure out.
Michael, I think it's amazing. And you know what?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised, because in sports, breathing has been overlooked. There's a few factors here. One is, with heat, respiratory rate is going to increase. And if the driver starts breathing faster and harder, well, basically the body is telling the brain that the body's under threat. Yep. And the brain is going to go into that fight or flight response. Now, combined with that, you've got an elevated heart rate. So controlling states is going to be really, really vital. And teaching drivers how to be able to downregulate, because of course the heart is affecting the respiratory system, but the respiratory system has an even bigger influence on the heart. We can control our heart rate to some degree by influencing our breathing. Now, The other aspect that's in this is that you have a helmet, and I'm assuming that there's no external air coming into the helmet, or is there?
There's a couple little air valves on the helmet, vents, but not much.
You're now got heat and also pooling of carbon dioxide, which is also going to stimulate respiration. And combined with that is the task on hand, which is stimulating in itself. It's really amazing how these guys are able to do it. Now, I would first, and this is your podcast, but I'm just thinking out loud here. I think this is anybody, when we think about breathing, if we want to think about how we're going to breathe in a car, we need to be thinking about how are we breathing outside of the car. And you were so right when you started bringing in nasal breathing. And by the way, our cognition is directly influenced by breathing through the nose. And there are studies on that.
Yeah.
I'm putting together a collection of papers. We're going to release it next month, because the human nose has 30 functions to the human nose. But you can't really find where these functions are. They're all over the place. So my task at the moment is just collecting them, putting them out there, and we're going to release one per day. Quite a few of them are cognitive based because of the information, the communication via the olfactory nerve from the nose up to the brain. So it's really, really fascinating. So in terms of then, we're looking at the physiological demands, and what other factors then? I'm thinking about concentration. I'm thinking about, so it's 90 minutes. And if that driver has a physical fatigue, it can relate to mental fatigue. And of course, then their attention. Does their mind wander? And of course, it's going to at some point. But what differentiates a really excellent driver versus one that, if their mind is wandering, is that ever monitored? How is that improved? And are the drivers taught how to concentrate?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to answer that last bit, are the drivers taught how to concentrate? I think that just comes with practice, right? And they're not taught how to concentrate unless us as performance coaches, I guess, assist with that. What differentiates a great driver with a good driver? That's a very good question. I mean, that's a very open-end question. My personal opinion is, I mean, it's I hate using this word, but it's the ability to be perfect. And what I mean by that is it's the drivers that just don't make mistakes, right? So that's just where they can just endure high cognitive loading and just be precise. Because the truth is, there's so many parameters in this sport that can affect your lap time, right? So we've talked about fatigue. Fatigue, then it can reduce your reaction time, and if your reaction time is reduced, then you're not changing gears in time or far quick enough, or you're not hitting your apex or your driver line as well. So then that's that. If you're losing 1 or 2 tenths per lap, that could be the difference between a podium and finishing P6. Because this sport's all about 1%, right? Same goes with enduring G-force, right? So there's some strong correlation where if the main muscle group that endures G-force in Formula One is the neck. So if their neck isn't strong enough, their head is going to be starting to go side to side from the lateral loading. And if your head's going side to side, you can imagine your vision, right? You got this horizontal lateral vision. All of a sudden, if your eye line starts to move side to side, your perception, your everything, even from a cognitive performance, starts to just go south, essentially, right? So then you start losing lap time on that front. I don't know. I keep referring to Saudi, but it's actually a prime example. So last year in Saudi Arabia, Kevin Magnussen had to fill in, or not fill in. I think he got reintroduced into Formula One after having a year off. And Saudi Arabia is actually a very, very high G-force track. It's got a super fast, long left corner, which I think endures up to 5 to 6 G, just that corner, right? And if you watch his onboard in qualifying, he loses his neck completely. He's turning, he's going along that long left, and you just see his neck, his head just starts resting on the headrest because he's just lost it completely. And he's lost so much lap time. And I remember we saw him after the race, and Daniel just started laughing when he saw him because Daniel saw the onboard, and Kevin knew what he was laughing at, right? And it's not anything against Kevin. He just had so much time away from the sport. Unfortunately, you can't really train for G-force, right? We train the neck a lot for sure. We use a very, very good neck harness, but it's one of those things where it's like anything, like football, right? You can do a full preseason of running, but until you jump in a match, it's called match fit, right? I call it race fit, essentially, right? Until you actually get in the car and actually start enduring those forces and getting used to those forces, your neck's not fully conditioned. So unfortunately for Kevin, second race in, he's gone to one of the most physical races. His neck just wasn't conditioned well enough as of yet. He said to Daniel, he said, "Yeah, I lost probably about half a second in my qualifying lap because I lost my neck," which just shows you how much time you can lose when your head is not in the correct stationary position. So that's another thing that I guess I forgot to mention, and that was a perfect example of watching Kevin's onboard. It's like he was super quick, but he lost so much time because his neck wasn't up to scratch as of yet because he had the year off.
And there's another aspect of it as well, that mentally, when you realize you're just after losing a little bit of time, that's going to affect some drivers then for the rest of the race because it's knocked you off form.
Yeah, exactly. And we spoke about the physiological demands. It's like, okay, now all of a sudden my mind is on my neck. Jesus, how am I going to keep my neck? All right. And I'm feeling like the burn, like the muscle burn, the tension. Same goes with a lot of some drivers get like muscle fatigue in the shoulders from the steering wheel. So all of a sudden, your mind goes to your pain sensors, right? So all of a sudden you're feeling pain in your shoulders. So you're not fully concentrated, you're not fully in your flow state. So yeah, there are so many parameters that can distract you, and then don't forget, you're trying to stay focused and you got an engineer talking in your ear as well. And you need to take in that information, and then you need to spit out the information that he's asking as well. So
it's amazing.
I can't even walk down a set of stairs and type a text message, let alone do what they're doing.
But visual spatial awareness as well. There was a study that came out from Israel in 2020, and visual spatial awareness, which is your ability to have your focus on a target, but also to read everything around you. So, for example, a player on a football, but obviously it's going to apply to a driver because they're watching both sides and ahead. It's higher with nose breathing versus mouth breathing. So if you want that study, I'll send it on to you. I'm just thinking,
Please do.
the old brain here is whirring away, you know. You said that drivers aren't trained how to concentrate. I find that absolutely bizarre in terms of, and maybe they are to some degree. Just a couple of things that are coming into my mind. What about drivers who are immersed in their mobile phones a lot, scrolling on Instagram and etc., and they're training the brain to be distracted? Is there any policy on that? And the second thing is, you mentioned about flow states, and I think it was also in that Drive to Survive, or maybe it was Michael Schumacher's documentary when they interviewed him back in his racing days. And he says, when I am racing, he says, myself and the car become one. Now that's a flow state. And I heard Ayrton Senna as 100%. Well. I quoted him in The Oxygen Advantage that almost that everything slows down, and at the same time flies, and the right action is happening by itself. To access this flow state, we need to have our physiology in balance. If we're too much of an increased stress response, it's going to knock us over. But for me, sleep quality. So there's a few questions tied in there, Michael. One is, you must be doing something to train the guys how to concentrate, because there's no way somebody can have 100% of their attention for 90 minutes with all of this stuff going on. How do they do it?
So I personally do. As a performance coach, I do. I have my cognitive methods of training Yuki's concentration, decision making, perception, and peripherals as well. So that's something that we apply outside of race weekends, but also it's part of our preparation. So we have a 45-minute preparation period. You could call it a warm up, essentially, before every session. So before P1, P2, P3, and qualifying and race. That I've seen massive improvements, and also in his reactions. So I do that. So that's how I help him with concentration and obviously enduring cognitive load under stress. I'll also put him in I'll also try and distract him. I don't know if you heard the whole Tiger Woods' his father, how he'd yell at him. And
it's in the book.
He's putting. Yeah. So like, honestly, methods like that. And I'm talking crazy methods, what I do to him. I won't disclose it, but I do some pretty bad stuff to him to try and distract him, and he's because. Go
on, tell us. We're dying to know, Michael.
Don't worry about it. We're very new in our relationship. We've only started working for 3 months, so he's still getting used to my training methods. But his ability to pick it up at the moment, like I'm pouring water on him without him even knowing. Like he's like losing his mind. Like, what are you doing to me? But now I'm doing some pretty bad things to him, and I can just see him just staying calm now. And I can see the type of reaction that we want to see, essentially. Yeah. So I do that. That was one of your questions. Yeah, flow state. The Last Dance is another example that, I don't know if you watch that, but Michael Jordan talks about like all the distractions that were going on about his father. People starting rumors about his gambling addiction, and then he just talks about, as soon as he crosses that white line, everything else is a blur, everything. And he talks about how he can get into his flow state, and he's like, nothing affects him. And so that was just another example, I guess, I wanted to throw in there.
And do you think the drivers are able to, so it's almost that they're able to compartmentalize that, regardless if something is happening in their private lives, as soon as they get into the car, they're able to switch on everything towards that? Or does it sometimes cross over? I'm assuming with some drivers, it can cross over.
So some drivers have very strong, like when I say some drivers, I'm talking about my drivers. I do have drivers that have the ability just to switch everything off. As soon as they put their helmet on and they get in that cockpit, nothing else matters. Some other drivers have had busy minds. So when there is external stresses, I do see that play a little bit of a part on their performance. So I do like to have like a midweek spill, I call it, where I sit down on Wednesdays and we just, me and my driver, we just spill what's bothering us, what's on our minds, what do we want to get off our chest. And it's not just him or her, it's me as well. So we'll talk together, like, because if I'm going to ask them to open up, the least that I can do is open up as well. So I got my midweek spill with Yuki in a couple of hours, which I'm looking forward to. We just sit down and just get everything off our chest, because a clear mind is what we want for optimal performance for these guys, right? So I like to do that as a coach. That's worked very, very well for me in the past. So I'll continue to do that. The phone is an absolute pet hate of mine. There's too much phone use with some in the past for sure that so I do need to monitor phone usage, because scrolling on social media just takes up so much like useless energy
Totally.
right, and it's just not what they need, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately that has been a very big barrier for some people, because these guys have such hyperactive minds. They don't know how to they don't know how to calm down. They don't know how to settle. So they just grab their phone and just start scrolling because they need to stay busy. And with that, with hyperactive minds comes struggle sleeping sometimes. So the good thing is Yuki is a very good sleeper. So I do monitor his sleep. So I have Yuki wearing a Whoop band so I can monitor his strain, recovery, and sleep. And that gets linked straight to my app. So I don't have to bug him in the morning. I just log on, his data comes through. I can see his resting heart rate, his HRV, and then that way then I can kind of dictate, okay, how's he feeling? He's primed, or okay, he's a bit fatigued. Maybe I don't put him through, our high intensity cardiovascular session today. Maybe I'll take the load off a little bit, and it helps me with my programming. And what I do, I track that data, and I kind of find like that peak balance of when I know he needs to be, when he's super fresh. So going to Bahrain last weekend, I looked at his numbers, and the correlation showed very, very, very clearly that, okay, we peaked him perfectly. And that showed we had a really, really good race weekend. He didn't make a single mistake all weekend, to a point where the lead engineer came up to me and said he actually raced his best race for AlphaTauri in 2.5 years. Wow. Because he literally didn't see a single mistake in his data. So that was very pleasing for me that the data did align quite well, and Yuki was quite chuffed with that. So I do have some strong data now to be like, okay, I know what kind of zone he needs to be in to be peaking, and I kind of know what zone where I can start pushing him when we have a training block available to do some hard training.
Do any of your drivers wake up at a dry mouth in the morning? Do you check that in terms of Whoop and HRV? And the other thing, before I forget about it, I'm just thinking about correct tongue resting posture, because that assists with balance. So is it ever used inside the car that when a driver is there, to help with the G-forces, the tongue should be resting up in the roof of the mouth, and the diaphragm also is mechanically linked with the throat muscles. We have 20 muscles in the throat. Mm-hmm. Now, typically my work is looking at the connection between the diaphragm and the upper airway dilator muscles in, for example, obstructive sleep apnea. But I'm just wondering, if the diaphragm is mechanically linked with the muscles in the throat, well, if we have a driver with dysfunctional breathing, who's breathing a little bit upper chest, they've got reduced recruitment of the diaphragm, and they may not be getting that stabilization up here. I'm only throwing it out there. So tongue resting posture and mouth breathing during sleep, because I'm conscious we've only a few minutes left.
Yeah, so I haven't got into mouth breathing when Yuki's sleeping. So I need to get into that, because there's been a lot that we're trying to get through together, because I only started with him 2-3 months ago. So we're already making great progress. But yes, that is one. Tongue positioning, no. I actually don't know much about that. So that's something that you could probably educate me on. But he doesn't breathe through. He's not a strong chest breather, which is good, because that is something that I visually look at, especially when we're on the bike. Thanks to your book, Patrick. Everything that I apply to myself, I'll then apply to Yuki and try and make improvements there. But yeah, tongue posture, no, mate. So that's probably something that you've brought to my attention.
It's interesting. There could be a connection there. So just kind of bring it all in together, because all of these skills are transferable. These guys are at the pinnacle. They're absolutely up there. And I think the mental skills are those, because I often use the idea, we spend 12 or 16 years in formal education and we're not taught how to concentrate. And we're not taught how to deal with stress. So both of those factors are going to be instrumental. So, for example, when you're looking at Lewis Hamilton, you actually know just by looking at him, he is so focused, and nothing is, and he is going to be in the zone, maybe not all races, but pretty much all races. If anybody was to say to me, what are the most important traits in life? Maybe I should be putting that to you. what do you think are the most important as a high performance coach? What are the two most important things that when you have a young driver, any driver, what do you really want to change first and why?
Sleep quality and hydration, because people talk a lot about external stresses, because life these days, there's so many external stresses, whether it's finances, relationships, social media, the media in general. You know, you watch the news and it's all bad news. There's no good feel good stories,
switch it
right?
off. Yeah.
I don't watch the news. Haven't in 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So, but what people aren't aware of is internal stresses, right? And one of the biggest internal stresses is dehydration. Generally, when we wake up, generally we're dehydrated, right? And dehydration has strong correlation to cognitive ability, right? And your focus. So for me, like as a coach, I like to improve the basics first, right? Because for me, it's like you need to do the basics right, especially in this environment where we're probably on 70 flights a year, and the year goes so quick. Sometimes you just feel like you're in simulation. You need to do the basics right. Once you've got the basics right and you've got that strong foundation, then you can start working on the little 1%ers that I was talking about earlier on in this podcast. So the basics for me: sleep and hydration. It's such an easy fix. Well, maybe not sleep, especially if you've got some sort of apnea. Like, it's not an easy fix, but
you can work on it though. You can work on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I say easy, I'm probably going to say sleep hygiene, right? Because your sleep habits is an
circadian rhythm, for example, with all the flights.
Yeah. And hydration is an easy fix. And that's something that most of the time athletes are just not aware of. Like I tell them, like, how much fluid should you be drinking per day? No idea. And it's crazy, like, to think that like hydration is the basic thing of just staying hydrated can improve your cognitive performance. It can improve your digestion. It can even help you lose weight, right? It can even help you like build muscle. Like, hydration is just so important. So yeah, to answer your question, they're probably the first two things I'll make an impact on.
Excellent. So Michael, I'm going to draw it to close. Listen, pleasure talking. What a wonderful sport. It's so cool to watch. And I wouldn't consider myself to be a petrol head, but I think maybe it's every man's dream is to drive fast, you know, to some extent. So it's so cool, and to see individuals pushing their parameters there. Thanks very much.
No, you're welcome. It's good to chat, and yeah, breathing is something that I've only got into probably the last year, and it's something that I really want to, I guess, hone in on from an education perspective, to start applying it a lot more to my drivers, because I do see a massive benefit in it. So yeah, I'll keep up with your content, Patrick, and I'll keep applying what I'm learning. And yeah, if we're doing well, you can probably put it down to what I'm learning.
Let's go for that 1%.
Yeah, exactly.
Great stuff.